Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of RIRE 1x1 with Zach Friedland. And we keep going back in time by years because today I get to sit down with the 2017 featured composer, Nick Jackson, joining us from his home in Columbus, Ohio. And Nick, so we met at Ohio State University, and you are from Ohio, and you grew up there and everything. I found the culture in Ohio to be just really interesting as a New Englander coming in there. Growing up in that state and living there your entire life, what's that like?
Yeah, well, I could say the same thing when I visited New England too. It seems like a completely different world almost. But yeah, I grew up usually near cities, not super rural, but not big city like New York or Chicago. So kind of suburbs. And so that's kind of what I grew up with. And even moving to Columbus, I've always kind of lived near the outskirts of the city until right now I'm downtown. But yeah, it's always been that Midwest kind of feel where, you have your farming and your agriculture, and there's like a nice mix of people because you have people from the city, people from out in the country. So yeah, you always have that like hospitality, I think, here with like a big group of people. And even going to school here, all people I knew were all from different backgrounds, and a majority of them, their family had always lived in Ohio. So I'd say most people I knew also grew up here, especially before college. Majority of people were from the area. Yeah, it's
Cool. Now, you play a number of different instruments. I know saxophone, bass, tuba, to name a few. I'm just curious because I'm not sure if I ever asked which one came first, and how did your musical career kind of begin?
Yeah, so I actually started, besides the recorder, in elementary school, which actually helped since I started on clarinet in 5th grade. And so that kind of, those skills carried over a little bit. But I wanted to play the saxophone was my first goal. And I think I had listened to some jazz as a kid and saw some saxophone players maybe on TV or something. For some reason, that instrument stuck out. It was either that or like another type of woodwind. So the school district I went to, we had to start on clarinet. If you wanted to switch to saxophone, you had to pick that reed instrument, and then in 6th grade, you would be allowed to switch. So I played the clarinet first for a year, and then ended up on alto sax. And then stuck with alto sax all the way. I spent a few years in college on the saxophone as well. And then I also played tenor sax and a little bit of bari sax.
Cool. And then you picked up tuba at Ohio State, and the Ohio State marching band was a big part of your college career. For those listening who might not know, do you just want to kind of talk about the significance of the Ohio State marching band and what effect that has, that experience of being in that band for 5 years had on your life, really?
Yeah, definitely. So going back to your first question too about growing up in Ohio, you always have your huge Ohio State Buckeye fans, and no matter what part of the state you're in, that kind of carries over. I know some states don't have as many big colleges maybe that are universal. You still have your Buckeye haters, but for the most part, growing up in Northeast Ohio, my family still watched Ohio State. And like I had my stepdad when I was in high school and middle school, he was a huge Ohio State fan. And he's kind of what motivated me too to consider going to Ohio State and potentially trying out for the band. So I think that's probably the case with a lot of people too, is they have family that they watch the football games or they know of the band. And with the marching band, it's pretty widespread now, especially with YouTube and the social media and all the viral videos they had. such as like the video game show from 2012, and we had the Hollywood show in 2013. And those were my first 2 years with the band. So I think they started gaining that widespread notoriety around the early 2010s. But even before that, throughout the state, I think there's that connection with the marching band at Ohio State because it's such a big tradition. You have your game day traditions down here where you go to see the football game. And then before that, though, you have your skull session with the marching band where there's a concert that people go to, and people line up early to come see the bands do their pregame in the stadium. So I think that big traditions part of it too, is it becomes one big Saturday afternoon, experience for everyone involved. So yeah, for the marching band itself, it's an audition group. So every time you're coming in, you audition each year. And so that's one of the big things we kind of prided ourselves on, was being, at that elite level where you want to always be your best and as best as we can be, and make sure we don't have anyone not giving it their all. And the amount of rehearsals we had, I think too, we would rehearse 5 days a week for a few hours, like 2 hours of rehearsal, and then we would spend time memorizing music and practicing drill on our own. I think that combined with the full game days on Saturdays, really kind of gives to that tradition. We have people coming in each year and they're aiming to be in the bands, just as I was coming from a school on the other side of the, northeast of the state. So I think for many people, that's the case, where that kind of prestige level is built up and kind of the tradition of the ensemble is built up. And so anytime they're interested in music before that, they decide, to be the biggest Buckeye fan they can. They come down and, they see all the great experiences and the opportunities on the field. So I think that's a big part of it. Just like, every college marching band, there's always the sense of tradition with your university and the connection you have with the alumni and the students and the team. And I think for Ohio State, it's the same. You just have a large scale, since there's so many fans throughout the country. It might be elevated a little because of that, but it's still a pretty, I think, traditional, like, marching band kind of style.
Yeah, I mean, I remember growing up, I loved marching band, and that was one of the big things that got me interested, was seeing Ohio State on TV, and it's definitely a feeling that you preserve the quality like no other marching band that, so I want to get into your composing a little bit. So
Yeah.
When did you actually start delving into music composition, and what were some of the first things you explored in that?
Yes. So, in high school a little bit, I practiced some arranging of, I can't remember, maybe a few like pep band songs or some pop music. But besides that, I never really practiced composition too much. Going back to the marching band, the main reason I came to Ohio State was to be a part of that band and to dot the I here as a sousaphone player for Script Ohio. So,
which you have done twice, right?
4 times.
4 times now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But no, I know you're thinking of the 2 football games, right?
Yeah.
So I had the Northern Illinois and the Michigan game in 2015.
Yeah.
Then we also did a pro game at the Browns. And
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. And then the Bowling Green game the year after, where the marching band does the 4 Script Ohio's.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're right. Those are the 2.
To reprise your role.
Yeah. That was my 5th year, so that was coming back for my 5th and final year. The sousaphone players, you have to be a 4th year to dot the I. So came back for a 5th year as one of the squad leaders for the sousaphones, and that was, we had some spots open, so I got those few extra
cool
opportunities. So, but yeah, going back to that was what brought me here, and I went to University of Akron for a year too, and I started as music ed there. So I was very interested in the teaching aspect of it and didn't really consider composition that much. And so when I came down here to Columbus, I stayed as an ed major for a year. But then I did become interested in, the art of creating music and the process. And I can't remember what flipped a switch in me, but one day I decided I wanted to become a jazz major to focus on music composition. And I think part of it was just seeing the opportunity with the different styles. I was interested in combining jazz and popular and classical and those very broad categories that we see anytime you look up a program. You have your classical composition versus electronic and all of that. So I was interested in seeing how that could all come together. And so, it was in 2014 when I first started taking lessons down here in composition, after I switched my major. And so that was kind of my background with it. It was kind of a more recent field for me either way, coming from an education background. I decided I wanted to ultimately explore the creative aspect of music. And so a majority of my beginning compositions were jazz focused and that kind of style. But then a few years ago, about 6 years ago, is when I shifted a little bit to focus on some other ensembles.
You mentioned already that you write a fair amount of electronic music as well as jazz and classical.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about, just in general, about your process, and also do you find that process changes depending on which, like you said, broad genre you're writing in?
Yeah, so I think overall it tends to vary a little bit, the process of composing. Most recently, I feel like I end up basing my compositions on either a type of sound I'm going for, or even more so some orchestrational possibilities. So in that way, I've become interested in timbre and, how can I incorporate that into different styles of music? So in that way, I think the process is similar in some ways. Like I'll sit down and if I'm at the keyboard, no matter what genre it is, I find myself performing some of the same things. If I'm writing, for example, my most recent piece was for 2 tenor saxophones, I would sit down at the piano and think of the harmonies I wanted and the lines I wanted and just see how they interacted with each other. I'd probably do that same thing with the jazz piece too, but I would most likely maybe start with some timbres in mind and then think of some harmonies first. So just as many people might do, is I would start harmonically maybe for a jazz piece and then maybe not as harmonically focused, maybe more contrapuntal or textural based for some classical style pieces. But I'm also interested in how those can be flipped too. Thinking of a classical style or like a concert band piece, maybe thinking of that in terms of harmony and texture, or like flipping the script, like maybe you think of it harmonically and then the texture comes last. So I'm kind of curious about all those possibilities too.
I want to come back to jazz in a minute, but I do want to stay on some of your electronic composition because you did a lot of really cool works for our student composer showcases. Forget what they were called. I've been to like 3 different schools and everyone has a different name.
Oh, yeah.
Did we call it new music or was it? I don't even remember. But if you just want to talk to us about, I remember there was one piece, and I'm sorry I forget the name, but it was about your experience with tinnitus.
Yep.
And so if you just wouldn't mind sharing just kind of the inspiration of that piece and how you kind of put it together.
Okay.
It came out really, really cool.
Thanks. I appreciate that. So I believe the piece is 2960 was the title.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah.
I knew it was like a number, but I didn't want to say the wrong one. So.
You're good. So the title comes from the frequency. It's actually gotten a little better. My ears haven't been as ringing as much, and it's still there. You know, it doesn't go away. But part of it was I was sitting there one day trying to come up with some ideas, and I was trying to think of some narratives to say or to tell without actually telling it. So just coming up with like a background, and that number is the frequency that I could pinpoint just sitting there listening to like a ringing. That 2960 was around the frequency that I could hear when I went and compared it to a frequency. So from there, I started thinking, how could I take different sounds and use that ringing sound to morph into some sort of narrative. So I ended up taking just an oscillator and taking that frequency and playing that. And then it was my first time working with multiple channels too, besides two. So I had a 4-channel for this one. So surround sound. I was interested in how, you know, the perception could be shifted for the audience. And so I experimented with moving that ringing sound around and then intermixing it with some distorted sounds and different noise generators. And I also went out and did some recordings, even at local places around campus, just walking around, going to class, going to the gym, going to eat somewhere, so different sounds you would hear, like the elevator, going to class, just something you might experience in your daily life. And for people who have that, who experience that, it's intermixed in their own narrative. So that was my goal there. And so it's really an experimentation with different sounds and what's effective with 4 speakers. And it was cool for the concert because the lights were low, and it's always cool to have a surround sound. Like the mood was nice for that kind of piece. So it was cool to see that come to life, because you can sit in the lab and write it, and this sound works. But it's for that type of piece, especially because you already know what it's going to sound like. The actual mood of the performance can change it quite a bit, I think, versus where you might not know what an acoustic piece is going to sound like 100%, depending on your performers or the hall that you're in.
Zero element of chance, essentially.
Yeah. So you kind of get rid of that chance in some ways, but it's still there with the atmosphere, or like what piece came before yours, what piece is coming afterwards. It all kind of frames it. So that was a fun one to work on.
And then go back to jazz. You also spent at least 2 years arranging for the Ohio Show Band.
Yep.
Which I'll give you a chance to explain what that group is, and especially because you talk so much about style, and they cover a wide variety of styles. What was that experience like working with that group?
Yeah. So I actually was working with them this year too, and then we had this whole situation. So we got everything ready for the final concert, and then didn't happen. But this year my role was lessened. So the previous 2 years working with Dr. Sean Wallace with the Ohio Show Band, he leads this group, and we always have a horn section and some vocalists and rhythm section, and the whole goal is to create a bunch of different genres, to experience a couple of different genres for the performers, so you can go from pop to country to rock and all gospel, all the above, and put on one continuous concert that goes on for a few hours. There's an intermission, but the whole idea is that one song goes right to the next, and it's just like a concert you'd go see by professional musicians. And he's a big proponent on the technology and in-ear monitors and all that kind of that
the whole concert essentially runs on one track.
Yeah.
In a sense, so
that's a good way to put it. Where you have you have a click track for the performers, and you have the string track, and you have all the background elements, and it just keeps going. There's no stopping. hopefully that's the goal. Just like you would see if you went and saw a concert at the Schottenstein or a big stadium. So yeah, this year I didn't focus as much on that. I was mainly writing for the horn section. So we had alto and tenor sax, and then trombone and trumpet, with some doublings on flute and clarinet. But the previous 2 years, I also focused on like the setup and getting the monitoring system to work, and mainly setting up the rehearsal space and working with the equipment. So this year I took a step back from that, and someone else coming up is doing that. And so that's a good opportunity for them. And it was for me to see how such a group comes together.
Yeah.
So yeah, for that group, all 3 years I worked on arranging for the horns. And so that process actually became a lot more fluent, I think, even this year. Because even my first year, I thought I'd written some nice horn lines, and it's a way to experience different styles, like from pop or trying to write like a country horn line, like that might be tough, or trying to write, here's a gospel song that's 9 minutes. How do I fit the horn parts in so they don't get repetitive, but that they're repetitive enough that they don't get lost? Like, and then part of it too was engraving the scores. So as a composer and arranger, that was a great experience. Setting up the scores to match up with vocal scores or to match up with the rhythm section. So I thought that was a great chance to do all of that. But I've noticed even with that, it became much like smoother, and I think it's a skill that a lot of people could focus on, and is pretty useful, I think. I'm sure from your work with them too, you probably agree that like, because you get to write in a bunch of different styles, you get to write the different
styles, you get to experiment with harmony, and yeah, definitely, like you said, figuring out how things fit in. So yeah, I did it for a year before you, and yeah, it's a fun experience, and then to put the whole concert together, and like you said, to see how the whole thing just hopefully runs. Yeah. Good time.
Yeah, you said a good groundwork for me to come into. Yeah, it's cool with, since you might go see, we saw Bruno Mars was one of the concerts we got to go to and played before, and but even big names like that, you have there's horns in there. They have a horn section.
Yeah.
So for many artists or even many composers, it might not be as apparent that that's written out there. You have these big name bands that need horn parts, and while they're often written by maybe the musicians themselves, you never, I don't know who's writing everything, or the songwriter, or whoever wrote the horn lines. It is such a big element that might not be noticeable at first, but if you took it away, you would have.
Yeah, and it gives you a little insight into how those concerts run. I mean, it's not on the same scale, but you kind of know what's going on when they're up on stage there. So it's cool.
Yeah, and that's cool for the students too. They get to wear the monitors, and for most of them, they've never done that. And so it's like, oh, we have to stay right in time, because if I don't, it's everyone else is in time. It's not. It's established, and it kind of makes the whole concert experience less mysterious. It becomes a more reachable thing.
And I don't know what's changed since I was there. When first year I did it, he did have, at least a lot of the students had the Avion control panel, so they could turn up the different sounds when they wanted to hear more or less of certain instruments. So I want to spend some time on Reverberance, which was the piece you wrote for the Rhode Island Recording Ensemble. For band piece. What was the inspiration and what was the process for that piece? It's on our CD Shades of Green, White, and Blue, which you can find on Amazon, and we will post a link to. But why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the piece started out, I had originally I was writing for a saxophone quartet, and just trying to experiment with different, not just the timbres, but the actual like setting of how the voices interacted. And I started to think of like being in a hall where the different, it's called reverberance. You have the different reverberations coming from the instruments themselves or from maybe another ensemble or something. So I started to try to see, like, if you were in this big concert hall, what could you hear based on even just these four instruments. So that was kind of the inspiration for that. It started as that, and then I took that melody I'd written and then transformed it. So it's not really the same piece, but the beginnings of that piece started for a smaller ensemble. So as I wrote it for the concert band, that was my first time writing for that instrumentation. So it was a good, I think, experience and like learning process, especially hearing it live, to hear like what sounds worked and what didn't come out the same way that you thought it would. And so as I was writing the piece, it was mainly focused on that, like combining different timbres and keeping the melody going, but having it kind of evolve, and then always keeping that kind of like reverb in my head, like how can things be sustained or moved around. Yeah, so, and that was kind of the first big piece that I wrote, longer than a few minutes. So it was a chance to really kind of get my feet wet with attempting like to write for a bigger ensemble like that. So that was the main inspiration for it.
Just want to go back for a minute to your interest in timbre.
Yeah.
Do you think the fact that you've played so many different instruments that are from so many different groups, you played tubas, brass, saxophones, woodwinds, basses, strings, has that kind of played a role in what seems to have put timbre at kind of the forefront of your thought process?
Yeah, I think so. I think just like not even consciously, that's maybe what I think of, or like my go-to element to experiment with. And so I think having experience with all of in some way, I've played pretty much all the families of instruments except percussion. I guess that's your specialty, not mine. So that's the only one, and I do find that that's as many composers probably do, that's the toughest group to start trying to think about, because that's all timbre, like in rhythm. So I do enjoy tackling, like diving into a percussion part, but it's definitely intimidating because it's all about rhythm and timbre.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess building on that with percussion too, the orchestra pieces I've written, I like trying to use the percussion, intermixed with the other instruments, and some traditional doublings and groupings, but also, how can you achieve these different sounds that still work, that still sound musical. So I think the same still applies with the winds versus the brass and the strings. And, while it's all stuff that's usually done, and you study in orchestration, they show you all those. And but I think building on those traditional combos and seeing how, especially even with the inclusion of electronic sounds or possibilities, I think I'm always interested in how can this next sound be made. Yeah. And while still maintaining some sort of tangible, like, musical idea. I think that's I've written some pieces where it's very extremely spectral and it's only about the timbre, but I think overall I try to take my background with each instrument, but still kind of attach it to a harmony or a melody or something that is a gesture that can continue on.
Yeah. I agree, and I think that's one of the things I love about the band is there's so many different combinations you can make, and once you throw things like saxophone and euphonium in there, it's endless possibilities. I want to just talk about, because I know you also have an interest in spectral music.
Yep.
And so for those listening who may not know, what is spectral music, and what's your interest in it? How did that develop?
Yeah, so spectral music, if you want to summarize it up, it's basically music that deals with different elements such as like time and like the development of texture over time, or the development of different characteristics, usually through time. It's more about creating a soundscape maybe versus traditional harmonic relationships. Although you can still have those, you could still have a very harmonically kind of traditional piece that still is then focused on the sound effects or so there's all sorts of variations on it. I mean, some big composers I've listened to, one of them being like RIRE. I know I listen to a lot of his pieces, and he has, for example, one that's for 2 bass drums, and it's the player is attached. Have you played that piece?
It sounds familiar. I don't think I've played it, but I think I know what piece you're talking about.
Yeah, they attach like rings and stuff to the bass drum and like different thing, and you move it and you make these different sounds. Mm-hmm. And that piece is very, very slow. Like the textures evolve very slowly, and it's all about the 2 performers working together. So in that kind of piece, that kind of spectral piece, it's not really any harmony at all. It's all sound effects. So I like taking that idea of developing sounds or developing textures and combining it with other things such as a melody or such as a gesture. But I think what got me into it, I know Dr. Wells here, he exposed me to a lot of those types of composers, and especially with electroacoustic music. Many of the early pieces were in the 50s, 60s, 70s. All those were very spectral based. And even to this day, I feel like if you had to summarize electronic music, it's very spectral. And so that's usually what you hear when you look that kind of stuff up. But I think that kind of style can be used even with the traditional sound. You could take an orchestra or a concert band. I haven't heard many spectral concert band pieces, but I'm imagining there are some.
There's a few. Look up Pepinition, and that's the big one that comes to mind.
Is that one based on is it a lot of different instrument families, or is it sound?
It's a lot of different, just not a lot of melody, just a lot of different sounds, and just again, like you said, like the different instruments and their different timbres, and it's cool.
Yeah, and I think I'll have to look that up. I think what's appealing for spectralism for me is that it's another way of developing the idea, like how do you keep your attention? Mm-hmm. I think that's a big thing I'm interested in, is how can I listen to a spectral piece for more than 5 minutes? And so then trying to get your audience to do that, or like what is going to keep getting our attention if there's no 5-to-1 harmonic motion or no deceptive motion. It's all, I think a lot of that is paralleled with maybe even how we listen to music. Recently I've been studying a little bit with change in music with one of my courses, and we talk about Spotify or similar groups, streaming services, where you're creating a soundtrack for when your daily life, you're walking around, you're listening to your favorite songs. To me, it's almost like that too, even with when you're writing for a band or for orchestra, you're trying to, in that style, you're trying to create that, this is the impression of the music they're listening to. Because I know sometimes if I'm driving and I have music on, you're not really focused on what all the harmonies are. You're not really focused on maybe what all the melodies are, but it's the overall idea of I like this song, I'm going to put that on. So I think that's a new way I'm interested in looking at that type of music. I think it's very relatable.
To me, it's the same with a piece of art. There's some art that has a melody, in the sense that okay, this is a painting of a house.
Yes.
You see the house, it's about the house. But there's other stuff like Jackson Pollock where there is, you know, the central idea is the holistic, you know,
Yeah.
picture of you have all this color and this interaction and everything. And so, like you said, it's like how do you listen for 5 minutes and continue that idea? It's, you know, how do you look at this and get an idea from it? So
yeah, I think that's a good example with, because you could look at the Jackson Pollock, every time you look at it, you could see something else, or even like with the house, you might see something else, maybe not as much. You might be inclined just to look at it as a house. But I think the same applies with music too, for general audience. You know, if you look at a painting of a house, it's very, we all know what that is for the most part, and it's something we can latch onto right away, and keep latching onto. And then when you think of the Jackson Pollock, or Impressionist, like any type of painter that is using non-traditional means to portray similar ideas, I think the same can apply to music, where we all have a general understanding that music gives us this mood or this impression. Like, we can get different ideas from music. So I think both types of those paintings, when compared to music, you know, they can reach the same audience. It just might be in different ways.
Want to talk about your teaching for a little while, because you are currently finishing, or you're almost finished with your doctorate at Ohio State, and you are involved in teaching a number of classes. So one, if you want to tell us what you're teaching, and then also just what's your approach to teaching composition, because I know you're teaching composition class.
Yeah. Cool. So currently we actually have finals week, last day's tomorrow, working on teaching counterpoint right now, elementary counterpoint. So we're working from, it's 18th century for the most part. And so studying a lot of Bach and similar composers. But for that class, we're working on like a chorale prelude and a 2-part invention and a minuet. So taking forms that most music students are familiar with in some way, maybe not inventions as much, or preludes. Minuets tend to be pretty familiar. So I find with that class now, it's a good opportunity to connect what you're learning in music history and what a lot of students might listen to on their own. For example, I know plenty of students that like Bach or that like that style. Some don't, but you know, for the most part, if you're a music student right now in university, you probably have some sort of appreciation for that style of music. So I think this class, I've noticed, this is my first time teaching it, but I've noticed that it's a very good way for connections to be made. Like, and a lot of it is composition. You know, all 3 of our projects we did were all composing. The final one is the only one they had to come up. Sorry, the last 2 were more involved. Like for a minuet, I had them come up with their own melody. So the whole thing was pretty much completely original, except you had your form to follow, which made it a lot simpler, I think. And then the final one, they were given a motive and they had to develop it for an invention. So still following a guideline, but it's different compositional abilities, like starting from scratch versus using the same idea for 20 measures, but in different ways. But from teaching it just for this semester, I've noticed that even more so than becoming confident on them as composers, I think, because a lot of students might not be 100%, I'm going to write minuets every day, but the skills of seeing how that type of music works, I think from what I've seen, like they then go back to listen to Bach, or they listen to other 18th century composers, even 19th century, 16th century. And it all starts to click a little bit more with, why are these pieces we listen to all the time, like, why do they work? Why is it there? And it makes learning all those rules make a little more sense. Part writing rules, and because then when I point out, hey, Bach broke all these rules right here, they get why, because it's the general aesthetic of the era is these rules, and then sometimes you can, for musicality, you can do something different. And I think the same applies for the composition class I taught in the fall. It was a much more widespread palette. We looked at all the way to minimalism. I had them write a minimalist piece for their final project, using some sort of cell of information or something to develop their piece. And they had 2 other projects with that. And I think from what because I've only taught that class once as well. So far I've noticed that I like having the students get to listen to the different type of genres, but then, you know, try to dive in when they can and not be afraid to, you know, copy some ideas, not be afraid to make mistakes and fix it, you know, or like not even fix it, but tailor it to what they want. Same with the counterpoint. Like I provide corrections, but it's always with in mind that, you know, you're still trying to be musical with everything. So I think it's been a really good experience, and it's definitely helped me as a composer too, just noticing like what certain students pick up on and maybe what I should pick up on. Like as a composer, having other people perform something, you start seeing, you know, different ways to view the same project. So yeah, I think it's been great, and I think my philosophy will continue to develop. But I'm very interested in providing a bunch of different genres or different techniques as a broad kind of idea of what composition can be, because that was just a beginning composition class too. So if it was the next level up, it would definitely be more specific. But I noticed that students, I think, found success with that, and even now with counterpoint, find success with having those few ideas to work with and get to practice their compositional skills without too much risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just because I'm interested to see how you're going to answer it, because you just, how would you define musicality?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that can be a very personal thing. I think it's also, you know, style based and tradition based. I think as a whole, you know, we might expect certain gestures or instrument usage or shape of melody to be more musical or musicality rich. So yeah, I think a lot of it might come down to what genre you're in, but it's all built on the expectation of what we want to hear, or what we've been trained to hear, I think. But to summarize it, I think I would say, you know, for example, with a counterpoint, I'm writing a minuet for a class, and here's these parallel, or here's a fifth, and then the melody leapt up too far according to traditional rules, like leaping a different way and not resolving it. But if that melody fit the contour of the whole piece, or if it felt, you know, like if you had some sort of emotional connection to that melody, or if it was a moment that you liked the results of, I think in that case I'd say, okay, you can make that adjustment. So I think the musicality can be very personal like that, where to me this melody needs to do this, or like it makes me feel this way, so I'm going to keep that, or like I want to seek that feeling out. And so I think that's how everyone can have their own tastes, and they all end up getting shaped a little bit towards a common goal. But just as we talk about melodies being singable or like a voice-like melody, you know, we tend to create melodies that are, the contour is as such that you can sing it and it flows well. To most people that might sound musical, but to some it might not, especially if they didn't grow up listening to music like that. Yeah, so I think it's a really tough question. I think it's, I don't know if you can give an answer to it, but
Everybody's
definitely,
answer is different. You know, it's
yeah.
just interesting to see what people say.
Yeah, no, I would say it's all about how that moment feels,
Mhm.
and can you, like, are you justifying this decision because it was something you wanted, or did you just write it and it happened, which can be good too. So, but you have that, like, there's usually that purpose behind it.
Yeah, I've had that experience lots of times where I've been writing and I'm like, that'll work. It just happens by accident. So,
Yeah.
yeah, you know, and sometimes it is very, very planned out, but
Yeah.
and going forward, you are gearing up for your dissertation. So just briefly tell us about what your beginning plans are for that, and anything else, any other projects that you have going forward right now. I know things are kind of on hold, but
Yeah.
nonetheless.
So most of my time has actually been spent partially for a class, but I'm working on making a study for the Academy Awards for film music. I'm looking at Best Picture nominees throughout the years and taking a look at their scores. So I developed a corpus for that, and so I think it's 513 films that I have the music kind of categorized into different genres. I'm finishing up actually now typing a paper on it. So that's been like a big part of my work right now that I would like to expand into a potential thesis. I think is that'd be for music theory, would be to keep taking a look at that type of corpus and study the trends and the genres of film music. And so far, I think I've found some interesting stuff on it. So, you know, as much as we talk, especially with regard to, you know, film music of today, it can be so eclectic and varied. But if you take a look at the Academy Awards, like Best Picture winners and nominees, it all tends to be, only a few of them are really electronic. Most of them still have orchestras. 98% probably have orchestras. Like you notice these trends that are still.
The last one that I can remember that really had a lot of electronics was Gravity. That was a nominee.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so that's a big one. And like, I know a lot of people quote like Inception as being a big, and that's very electronic. And then from there, every movie has kind of been more ambient, more sound, but it's not really been electronic. It's been mainly orchestra or other things. So that's why I'm interested with that. So I think for a thesis, I might expand on that. And then for my dissertation, compositional wise, not 100% sure yet, but I'm interested in practicing sequencing and sampling, either for like a film project or a video game project or media project, something. So either I'll seek out some other students that have a project that needs music, or I might, you know, craft my own in my head and write music for a theoretical something. The main idea would be to get more practice sequencing with like a workstation and trying to make the sounds realistic, and to get that whole process down. That's probably my main focus. So I think my dissertation will involve that.
Awesome.
And then the document for that could be the film score, depending on how I want to tailor that kind of study. So it's all going to evolve around media, music in some way.
Awesome. Last thing I'm going to ask you before we go, because I know you're a big sports guy. How do you think the Browns did in the draft?
I think, you know, given the circumstances, I think we'll be okay. What do you think?
I don't know. You know better how I don't know all the Browns picks. I'm happy with what the Jets did. I think we got Darnold, the protection that he's going to need. We got we got a good wide receiver in there. So hopefully there'll be NFL this fall.
Yeah, that's the Yeah, I'd have to take a look at all the picks again. But
Yeah.
you guys still have Darnold. That's still a
thing.
still a thing.
That's so.
I know. I'm hoping that Baker has the team around him that he needs.
Yeah.
But I think that's always going to be a question. I don't think that's, especially with the staff. Like I don't know how that's going to work, but
yeah,
we'll see. I mean, I saw a lot of Ohio State players went in the draft, so that was nice.
Well, it was a good first round, especially for the Ohio State players. Technically, if you include Burrow as honorary, we went 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So
honorary, yeah. No, it's they were all teammates.
Yeah.
I believe when he was here.
Yeah. So awesome. Well, it is always a pleasure to sit down with you. And before we go, tell people where they can contact you, email, website, social media, whatever your preferred method is.
Yeah, sure. So I'm working on a website that'll be up at some point. So my email would work. It's jackson.2097@osu.edu. Or I'm on social media too, Facebook under my name, or that's the main one I have, but I'm out there on that too. So cool. Either way, yeah. Or if they reach out to you, and then that'd be good.
And for more information on what we do, you go to www.rirecording.org. You can see our whole collection of RIRE 1-on-1 interviews on the website or on our YouTube channel. And for myself, www.zjfmusic.com. Until next time, thank you for listening. Thank you to Nick, and stay safe, stay healthy, and please stay home.